Hello and welcome friends. Today we are going to start the next unit wherein we have to discuss the public sector, the private sector, the cooperative sector and the small scale sectors in India. So today we'll be discussing the public sectors in India. And now what is basically public sector? I think you would be a little bit aware by now as to what public sector means. So just to briefly go through whatever you have read in earlier classes. This is that part of economy which is controlled by the state, and by the state means basically on behalf of state it is the state government or the central government or maybe some other kind of government which is controlling this particular part of economy. So the controlled by the state is basically exercised by the state governments or the central government. Then these are the businesses with majority government control. Most of the control in these businesses is with the government, which means the government, it could be the state government, it could be the central government, it could be some other government, for example the local governments also, the municipalities and the panchayats, and there could be joint ownership also, which means maybe central and the state or state and the municipal corporations, they may be having joint ownership also. However, in all the cases, the stake of more than 50%, that is a minimum of 51%, should be with the government. This is what is meant by majority government control. So here when we are talking about majority government control, we are not talking about the special majority which is 75% and above. We are talking about simple majority which is 51% and above. So if even 51% of these stakes are with the government, any government, it could be central, state or some local government, even then the business can be called to be a public sector enterprise or a public sector unit, which you generally term as PSU. Now you can understand and you would recall from our earlier discussions that this is basically a very dominant feature of centrally planned economy. In centrally planned economy, most of the businesses are run, managed and controlled by the government. So this is a dominant feature of centrally planned economy. However, this is not to say that public sectors are not present in mixed economy or for that matter in capitalist economy. Even in capitalist economy there can be a little bit of presence of public sector, and we have discussed that while discussing the fact that there is no pure capitalist economy. So even capitalist economies also, you find that some of the businesses are still run by the government or still managed or controlled by the government. However, in most of the economies you would see that public sector is generally present in those sectors which are basic goods or basic industries or strategically important industries. For example, I'll give you example of a basic industry. Iron steel can be a basic industry because it is used for so many purposes, be it production of machinery, be it construction, be it building construction, be it shipbuilding. So it is required in most of the industries, and that is why it is considered to be a basic industry. Again, strategically important sector, one sector can be arms and ammunitions, the other one can be the atomic weapons, and one more strategically important sector is the oil and gas production as well as refining. So generally the public sector would be present in those sectors, those industries which are fulfilling the basic needs or which are strategically important for a particular country. So since these industries are very important, very vital for the survival of an economy, so the public sector is made to participate in these industries, because you cannot leave these industries to the discretion of the private sector. So in these kind of industries generally public sector presence is noticed. Okay, now let us talk about public sector in India. So as far as public sector enterprises in India is concerned, some of the businesses in India are reserved exclusively for public sector, which means there is no private sector participation in these sectors. And whether a particular industry or whether a particular sector of economy would be reserved for public enterprises or would it be reserved for private capital, or would it be kept open for both of them, that basically is dependent on the policy pronouncements, generally the industrial policy pronouncements, which we call the IPs, industrial policies. So the latest industrial policy that we have had here in India is IP 1991, which is also called the new industrial policy or the new economic policy. So generally these kind of provisions are there in the policy, and according to whatever has been mentioned in the policy, the different entities, be it the public sector or the private sector, they are mandated to enter or not enter a particular field of business activity. So as far as India is concerned, some businesses are reserved exclusively for public sector, which means there is no private play, there is no private capital in these businesses, which includes railway operation and atomic energy production, the production of atomic energy. For that we have a government organization which is called Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited. Likewise, railway operations are being run by Indian Railways, so no railway operations are being run by any private entities here in India as of now. Again, businesses, then we have a second category of businesses wherein the public sector presence is there. However, the private sector is also present in these field of activities or in these businesses. These include banking. You would recall that private sector is also present in banking. However, we are only going to concentrate our focus on public sector presence in these sectors. So in banking we have State Bank of India, Punjab National Bank, Union Bank of India, Bank of Baroda, and you would recall from the newspaper readings that only recently government has started implementing its plan of merging many of the banks. So the mergers are underway. So this is how the banking industry is in India. As far as the public sector banking is concerned in India, it is being reorganized. Then we have the example of insurance. We have got LIC, which is basically a life insurance firm which deals with life insurance products. The name is Life Insurance Corporation. Again, we have general insurance firms, or which we call the non-life insurance firms, which include Oriental Insurance and New India Insurance. Then we have heavy machinery, Bharat Heavy Electricals Limited. For oil and gas production, we have Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, Gas Authority of India Limited, and Oil India Limited. Oil retailing, which is basically selling to the end customer, we have got Indian Oil Corporations. These are all government-owned firms, government-owned businesses. Coal mining, we have got Coal India Limited. Then in power production, we have got National Thermal Power Corporation, which initially started with production of thermal power, that is use of coal to generate electricity, but now slowly they are diversifying into greener forms of energy also. Considering the shift that is happening across the world to more greener forms of energy, so they are also setting up power plants which are solar based power plants, solar energy based power plants, and wind based power plants. Then if you talk about the steel production, we have got Steel Authority of India Limited, which is the public sector behemoth in India, and then we have the Rashtriya Ispat Nigam Limited. Then we have the aircraft manufacturing, HAL Hindustan Aeronautics Limited takes care of aircraft manufacturing here in India. They produce aircrafts for military purpose also, defense purpose also. Then as far as telecommunication services are concerned, you know very well BSNL and MTNL are there. While BSNL is across the country, MTNL basically caters only to Delhi and Mumbai, these two metropolitan cities, and that is why the name Mahanagar Telecom Nigam Limited. Then we've got the airport operations. As far as the airport operations are concerned, Airport Authority of India is there. So these are all public sector organizations. In shipbuilding, we have got Goa Shipyard, and there are other organizations also. Then in mining, we have got Hindustan Copper Limited. Alloy manufacturing is Mishra Dhatu Nigam Limited. Alloy is a mixture in a certain ratio of two or more elements. So as far as alloy is concerned, it is the public sector enterprise which is functioning here in India is Mishra Dhatu Nigam Limited. And as far as tourism is concerned, we have got IRCTC and Indian Tourism Development Corporation, ITDC, and Indian Railway Catering and Tourism Corporation. So we have got these two public sector enterprises. As far as airlines are concerned, you know very well that we have got Air India, which government is planning to privatize soon. Now you must be wondering why some of the examples have been given in different colors. We have got red, green, and orangish yellow color here. Basically what I'm trying to tell you is that basically all these three, they are actually representatives of different categories. In India, public sector organizations are the profit making ones. They are basically categorized into Maharatnas. Maharatnas have been shown in this orangish yellow color. So BHEL, ONGC, GAIL, IOC, Coal India, NTPC, SAIL, they are all Maharatnas. Then the second category is the Navratnas. They are, we can say they are a little down as far as the hierarchy is concerned. So Navratnas, they have the secondary status after Maharatnas, and in Navratnas, some of the examples are Oil India Limited and Rashtriya Ispat Nigam Limited, Hindustan Aeronautics, and Mahanagar Telecom Nigam Limited. And as far as Mini Ratnas are concerned, the ones which have been shown in green, they are all Mini Ratnas. So these are all categories in which the profit-making public sector enterprises are categorized. And why is this categorization done? See, Maharatnas, and on what basis? The first thing is on what basis basically this categorization is done. Basically, this is done on turnover, this is done on profits. I'm not going into very specific details about how the categorization is done. I'm just giving you a brief idea. So based on the profit making, based on the financial record in the last 2-3 years, based on what turnover has been, based on that we categorize the profit making PSUs in these 3 different categories. And the ones which have been categorized as Maharatnas, they are given more autonomy. So they can take decisions with greater financial implications without having to go to a ministry or having to go to the government every single time. Likewise, Navratnas are also given some autonomy, but the level of autonomy is much less than in the case of Maharatnas. In the case of Mini Ratnas, the level of autonomy is even lower. And why is this autonomy given? Because these organizations are earning the government quite a significant amount of profit. They have been profitable, which means they can survive on their own without having to worry about clearance for every single thing from the government. So they are provided this kind of autonomy, right? So that is why I've mentioned it here. Now you understand that in India, PSUs are categorized into Maharatnas, Navratnas, and Mini Ratnas. Now please don't think that we have only these 10-15 odd PSUs in India. There are so many PSUs in India. I have not quoted all of them. I'm just trying to give an example of all the sectors in which we have a presence of a public sector enterprise. So the basic idea was to give you just an example, just an overview. So don't think that these many PSUs are here in India. There are so many PSUs here in India, and some of them are loss making as well. The example is at the bottom of your screen, which is Air India, that is why the government is planning to sell it to some private firm. Now let us talk about the objectives behind setting up public sector enterprises. What would be the objectives? Number one is capital and capital investment, which is basically long-term investment. Now first thing is, capital investment stimulates the economy. Capital investment means there would be an improvement in efficiency. Just giving you an example, it could be purchasing a cutting edge technology, it could be purchasing a machine with greater efficiency. So naturally it will ultimately lead to improvement on efficiencies in various business processes. More efficiency would mean that the business would expand. Business would expand would mean that the people who are working with that particular business entity, they will be able to have more salary, and once their salary increases, they would be demanding more products from the market, and naturally this would kick-start a cycle of growth, continued growth in the economy. And that is why capital investment is some kind of a stimulant for the economy. And apart from this very reason, there are other reasons also wherein because of which we seek capital investment from the public sector enterprises. One reason is that in strategically important businesses which are very, very important for the security of the country, for example, oil and steel production. Just assume, for example, if suppose what would happen to the economy of the country, suppose you do not get oil for your requirements, there would be no movement of vehicles. Many of the machines and many of the industries which use oil as a fuel, they would not be able to operate anymore. So that is why oil is something which is strategically very important for a particular economy. Likewise is the case of steel, and I've told you that steel is used for so many different purposes, be it the production of machinery, be it the production of consumer durables, be it the production of automobiles, be it the production of construction of various bridges and buildings. So steel is something which is strategically very, very important for an economy, and we cannot leave strategically important sectors like these to the private capital, to the private sector, and that is why we have ensured that public sector is present. There's a presence of public sector enterprises in these spheres of economic activity. Again, there are businesses which have long gestational period. Gestation means the time difference between when the project starts earning you money and when the project was started. The time lag between when you actually start investing in a project and the time when the project starts earning some money for you. So this is called the gestational period. If you want to set up a small, let's say if you want to set up a small tea shop, the gestation period would be very low. You may want to start today and you may start investing today. You would set up your shop today and maybe tomorrow you would start earning something from that shop. So the gestation period is low. But as far as constructing a power plant is concerned, constructing a building is concerned, constructing a highway is concerned, an airport is concerned, these are all projects which have a long gestation period. The gestation period may be 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 12, 15, 20 years also. And that is why private capital is not very keen to invest in these kind of long gestational period projects. So what happens is the public sector chips in. So that is one objective that we aspire to achieve through the presence of public sector. Then another objective which is there is to encourage the small scale and ancillary industries. How do the public sectors do that? Public sector basically purchase their raw material from small scale industry and ancillary industries, and this is how this support the small scale and ancillary industries. In fact, there are provisions which mandate that public sector should purchase a particular threshold of the requirements from micro, small and medium enterprises. So this way public sector has been also lending support to the small scale enterprises by buying their products. So this is another objective with which public sector units are set up. Then generation of employment opportunities. You know, public sector in India is among the largest, one of the largest providers of jobs to the Indian youth. So generation of employment is another reason why we have got public sector enterprises. Then balanced regional growth is another thing that is aspired for by the public sector enterprises or by setting up the public sector enterprises. For example, if you talk about steel plants, in India steel plants have been found, they have been set up in Bhilai, which is in Chhattisgarh, again a very remote part of the country, a significantly less developed part of country than our urban centers like Delhi and Mumbai. Raurkela again, similarly in Durgapur in West Bengal. So in all these places which are relatively less developed, which are relatively remote and which are relatively far off from our urban metropolitan centers, if you are setting up a steel plant, then naturally you would help in the development of that particular region, because not only the steel plant would be set up, there would be some ancillary industries which would also come up. There would also be, for example, the employment would be generated for local youth. There would be improvement in transportation and communication facilities, because if the steel plant has been set up in, let's say, Bhilai, naturally you would have to bring in raw material from somewhere and then you have to ship out the final product. So there would be an improvement in the transport infrastructure also. So this will ultimately lead to development of the particular region in which the plant has been set up, and this way there can be achieved a balanced regional growth. There can be achieved a balanced among different regions vis-a-vis the regional growth, and this is what is expected from the public sector enterprises. Again, if you look at fertilizer plant which is at Sindri is a place in Jharkhand, again a relatively poorer and relatively less developed part of the country. So one of the aim that PSUs try to achieve is balanced regional growth. Again, one more thing that the public sector enterprises are set up for is to generate financial resources for the government. And how do they do that? You know that many of them, they are profit making. Many of the public sector organizations are profit making, and naturally in all these organizations at least 51% of the ownership has to be with the government, because then only we can call them PSUs. And 51% ownership with the government means that if the PSU declares a dividend distribution, it declares that it would be paying its stockholders a dividend. 51% of that dividend has to come to government. In case the government's ownership is more than 51%, let's say it is 85%, so 85% of the dividend earnings would, or let's say 85% of the dividend would go to the government, and this would increase the government earnings. This way the government would be able to increase its revenues through dividend payments from the public sector enterprises. So this is another objective which has been set up for the public sector enterprises. Now let us look at the various problems which are being faced by our public sector enterprises. Number one is slow response to environmental changes. They are not very fast to respond to environment changes. You have a look at BSNL. If there is a change in policy, the very next day Airtel or Idea, they might be ready with a new plan, but that may not happen in BSNL, and that is why it is slowly losing the market share to these more agile companies which are faster as far as the response to the market changes is concerned. They are faster to respond to the market, so they are more agile, and that is why BSNL is losing to agile companies like Jio or Vodafone, Idea or Airtel. Again, you have a look at Hindustan Machine Tools. They used to produce wrist watches, but they could not track the change that was happening in the environment, wherein phones, they flooded the Indian market and people stopped wearing. Many of the people stopped wearing. Those who were wearing it only for keeping time, only for keeping a track of time, they stopped buying wristwatches. But HMT was very, very slow to respond to these changes, and now if you say HMT used to be a very well-known brand at one point of time around 15-20 years ago, but now if you look at the market for wristwatches, you would find that HMT is not doing that well. So this is one problem with the public sector enterprises. They are very slow to respond. They are not proactive. In fact, they are reactive, and they react also a little too late. While on the other hand, private firms, they are really proactive. Even before the change takes place, they are ready to go to the market. They are ready to come up with a refurbished product, launched a refurbished service in the market, and in fact look to prosper from those changes. You look at the current COVID-19 crisis, you would find that so many private education institutions have come up. They have started exploiting this opportunity by providing free online classes to various students across the country. So they are not only able to respond to these changes, they are also benefiting from these changes. On the other hand, if you look at the government institutions, if you look at the institutions like our own degree college or the university, you would find that they are very slow to respond to environmental changes. So this is one major problem with the public sector enterprises. Again, poor policy making and execution. Policy making is also poor. Not only the policy making is poor, but also the execution. So there are issues with both policy making as well as execution, and one example is Air India, because of which now Air India is having an arrears of almost rupees 50,000 crore. So it is having an arrears of rupees 50,000 crores. It has to pay this much amount still, and every single day it is incurring losses. So this is one major problem with the public sector enterprises, and that is why they are not all of them are profitable, and not all of them are profit making. Now you would be wondering as to why this happens. Poor policy making and execution. The reason for this is government intervention. Since they are owned, 51% or more of the ownership is with the government, so naturally the government would want to intervene, and there is a lot of intervention from the government side. For example, mandating capex. Capex is capital expenditure. How much a particular company is going to spend on capital expenditure, which means on buying a machine, on buying a piece of land, or on constructing a building. Now this ideally should be decided by the board of the public sector enterprise, but many a times there is a direction from the government. And why does the government direct the public sector enterprises to incur a particular amount of capital expenditures? Because they know that if the public sector enterprises, they spend some money on capital assets, ultimately this is going to spur a cycle of growth in the economy. I have discussed it a little while ago in this very lecture. So that is the main objective of the government, and for that they ask the PSUs to spend a particular amount at least every year on capital assets. So this is one example of how government intervenes in the functioning of public sector enterprises. Then we have another example of wherein the public sector enterprises, they are made to serve the unprofitable segments of the society. For example, if you talk about BSNL is one company which is serving the most remote locations of the country, which many of the private enterprises don't find lucrative because the population is sparse, there is less opportunity to earn significant amount of revenue, so they generally keep away from these kind of remote places. On the other hand, it is BSNL which then fills up the gap and then provides the service in these parts, though when they are trying to do that, they might be incurring losses. Again, there is an example of road transport corporations. You have your own Uttarakhand Road Transport Corporation. They are made to ply on routes which are not very profitable, wherein the passenger traffic is much less, but they are made to ply in those routes because of local politics. So, and once you are plying on these routes, you are not able to earn sufficient revenue. Naturally, your balance sheet would suffer. Naturally, your profit making capability would suffer. So this is why government intervention has basically led to decline in the performance of the public sector enterprises. Overstaffing is one more issue. You would find that generally the number of people that are working in a public sector organization, they are far more than those who are working in a private sector organization of comparable strength or of comparable size. And the reason is that while in a private organization, if there is a decline in the business, the private organization would very quickly terminate the services of the staff which it considers redundant, which is more than what they require. On the other hand, that is just not possible with a public sector enterprise. They simply cannot start giving pink slips to their employees just because they've started suffering business losses. So that is why generally there is a lot of overstaffing in public sector enterprises. So naturally the operating cost would be higher because you are paying much more than what other competitors in the private sector they are paying. You have number of people working with you is more than what is actually required. So naturally you'll have to pay them more money. Your labor cost would be higher. On the other hand, your efficiency would also be lower because you are not agile enough to look for the best technology, to replace your technology, to go for the best of the machines. And whenever you even try to do that, you will have to first get a clearance from the government. So naturally it will ultimately lead to lower efficiency levels. If you look at Steel Authority of India Limited and then you compare the efficiency level with the Chinese firms, you would find that Steel Authority of India's efficiency is much lower than that of Chinese steel production firms. And that is why Steel Authority of India is facing such a large number of issues as far as competing in international markets is concerned. Not only in the international markets, they are finding it difficult in the domestic market in our own country also because of the cheap Chinese goods. And why are the Chinese goods relatively cheaper? Because they are more efficient. So this is one problem with our public sector enterprises. Again, one more issue with the public sector enterprises is the worker militantism, wherein the workers are very, very aggressive. They indulge in a lot of indiscipline. There is a lot of demand for wage hikes, and if the government somehow does not agree to that demand, if the management of the organization does not agree to that demand, they may also then announce a strike. So ultimately what happens is, because of this, there is a lot of friction between the management and the workers. There are a lot of days on which there is no work done, and for no work done you still have to pay wages, and which means ultimately the organizations, the public sector organizations, their efficiency and their overall performance declines. Again, one more issue why the public sector enterprises are not performing that well is the lack of motivation on the part of employees. And why is that the case? Employees are basically not motivated enough there. Why is that the case? The promotions in most of the public sector organizations, they are still time based, which means if you spend a particular amount of time in a public sector organization and if you complete a particular tenure, you would certainly be promoted regardless of your performance. That is not the case with a private sector organization. Therein, what speaks out is your performance. If you are not able to perform, you might be the senior most guy in the company, you might you may still not be promoted. On the other hand, if you perform, you may rise up to the level of CEO despite being just 35 or 40 years of age. And you have seen this example in so many various companies that you have. You talk about the companies here in India, or you talk about international firms, you talk about companies like Google and Alphabet, you talk about Indian firms which are very well known outside also. You would find that CEOs, they're maybe 45, 50 years old. Why? Because they have been exceptional performance, and that is why they were promoted before their time, just because of their exceptionally good performance. So basically the employees in private sectors, they are more motivated to work harder because ultimately they know that it will result into greater rewards for them. But that is not the case with public sector employees, and because of which the public sector employees are not able to function, they are not able to perform according to their potential. So these are the various problems that are plaguing the public sector enterprises here in India. Our next discussion will be on the